There's a major issue with the way we've been doing our CSS thus far that you may have anticipated, and that is when we select an element to style, our style rules get applied to all of those types of elements throughout our web application. And there are many times where we don't want this to be the case. We want some paragraphs in certain sections to be styled differently than paragraphs in other sections. Thankfully, CSS gives us some options to be able to distinguish style rules between elements of the same type. The first way to distinguish elements is through something called classes, and the second way is through something called identifiers. Now, classes can be applied to multiple elements, while identifiers must be unique to a single element. And to demonstrate how they work, we have two paragraph elements here that we would like to style differently and therefore need to classify or identify in order to do so. So I'm going to go ahead and add both a class and an identifier to each of these elements. And the class I'm going to add is block quote. This is just an arbitrary class that I decided, as well as an identifier. And for the first paragraph, I identify it as Star Wars. For the second paragraph, I identify it as Toy Story. And no other element, paragraph or otherwise, can have this identifier in our web application. And let's view the power of using classes and identifiers by going into our style.css file. First, let's add some style rules to our body element. And the rules that I've elected to add are to set the font family as Roboto and the color as hex code 858585. Next, we want to apply specific rules to our header 1 element. And here I've set the font weight of our header 1 element to be 400, the size to be 3em, and the alignment to be centered. And similarly, we'll make the font weight of our paragraph element 300, the font size 1.5em, and the text alignment also centered. Now, it may seem redundant that we set the text align property to center in both the paragraph and header 1 element when we could have just done it in the body, since all of the elements, all the text in our web application fall into these two categories and are centered. However, in reality, we anticipate having many more paragraphs in H1 elements, and so we don't want to go ahead and apply that default setting there. It's best to apply them at the individual elements in that case. Now that we've applied style rules to our elements, we want to go ahead and apply style rules to our class and identifiers. And the way that we're going to select our class, block quote, is by prepending it with a dot. The dot tells the browser to apply this style rule to a class rather than a specific element. And the rules that we're going to apply are to set the font size to 2em, the color to a little bit darker shade of gray than the default color, and then set the background repeat to no repeat. And the reason we set this background repeat here rather than in our identifiers actually falls back to what we just discussed about the text alignment in our paragraph and H1 elements, although in this case it's the reverse. We want to follow a principle called dry, which means do not repeat yourself. So don't write any extra lines of code if you don't need to. In the case of the text align properties, we felt like we needed to set those in each of the individual elements, but for this, the no repeat background, we can set that in our class rather than each of our identifiers. And speaking of our identifiers, we select them by using a hashtag, by prepending a hashtag, and this tells the browser that we want to apply these style rules to a specific ID. In the case of our Star Wars ID, we want to set the height of the paragraph to 20% of the viewport, the color to yellow, the background image to a URL of a image that we found online, and a background position of center, as well as a 5% padding on the top of our text. And similarly, for our Toy Story ID, we're going to set the height to 55%. We're going to set the background image to a Buzz Lightyear image, as you can tell, and we're going to set the background position to bottom and center. Now let's go over to our browser and see the effect that all this has on our web page. Of course, this is what it looks like before adding our styling rules, and when we refresh, we can see what it looks like after, and it's much better. And one thing we might want to do is inspect our web page by right-clicking on it and selecting inspect to see which style rules were actually applied to each of the elements, or at least to one element. So I'm going to inspect this paragraph, the Toy Story paragraph, to see what elements were, or what styles were applied. And when we look, we can tell that, for instance, down here, it inherited the Roboto font family from the body selector rule, but it overrode the color rule with the block quote class color.